Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record supportive letters from National Taxpayers Union and Americans for Tax Reform.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to mark up H.R. 1843, the Clyde Hirsch Sowers Respect Act, which puts an end to an improper use of civil asset forfeiture by the Internal Revenue Service. Here's a quick background. If a person deposits $10,000 or more into a financial institution, that institution must submit a currency transaction report to the Treasury Department. Avoiding this reporting requirement by purposefully staying below the $10,000 limit is a federal crime known as structuring. Structuring was made illegal in 1986 to prevent large-scale criminal enterprises, terrorists, and money launderers from hiding their money from authorities by consistently depositing just shy of that $10,000 limit. When structuring is believed to have occurred, the IRS can use its civil asset forfeiture authority to seize funds and force the owner of the funds to prove that they were obtained legally. So far, so good. We can all agree that terrorists and criminals shouldn't have access to illegally obtained money, and if the IRS had used its civil asset forfeiture authority solely to disrupt criminal enterprises, we wouldn't be marking up this bill. But of course, that's not what happened, and this is a problem we've got to solve. Let me tell you about someone who had their money seized by the IRS. Andrew Clyde, who served 3 combat tours in Iraq, came home, opened a store in Georgia. Mr. Clyde had an insurance policy that only covered up to $10,000 in off-premises losses. So, at the end of the business day, he regularly deposited less than $10,000, of course, because his policy only covered $10,000. For that reason, the IRS seized $950,000 from him. The agency then threatened him with criminal structuring charges until he agreed to settle and forfeit $50,000 to the IRS. That was after he spent nearly $100,000 in legal fees. Despite no underlying criminal activity, Mr. Clyde lost almost $150,000. In February of 2015, the Oversight Subcommittee examined these practices by the IRS, and I have never seen such a display of bipartisan outrage before. This practice was so inherently wrong that no one rose to the defense of the Internal Revenue Service, and I'd like to particularly thank the ranking member, Mr. Lewis, and Mr. Crowley, the lead sponsor of this legislation. Together, we've been fighting this battle for almost 2.5 years. In that time, we've had some wins. IRS Commissioner Koskinen apologized to the victims of this practice on behalf of his agency. In fact, a year later, he even changed IRS procedures to restrict the use of civil asset forfeiture cases in which the money was earned illegally, a common sense decision that we hope to codify with this legislation. And I'm also heartened to say that in March of this year, the IRS finished its process of reviewing all 454 contested cases that occurred before the rule. The agency either returned or recommended that the Department of Justice return approximately 80% of the funds. The IRS themselves returned over $6 million to honest Americans who were victims of this government outreach. One such case, which ended in the seizure of returned funds, was Randy and Karen Sowers, dairy farmers from Maryland, who served as one of the namesakes of the legislation we're considering today. And while the IRS returned over $6 million in seized funds, they've also recommended to the Department of Justice they return a whopping $16 million. And this is where the case takes a darker turn. The Department of Justice has a long, did I say long, way to go in tackling the backlog of undecided cases. In May of this year, Congressman Lewis and I wrote to the Attorney General inquiring of how many cases had been reviewed by the agency. Acting Assistant Attorney General Samuel Raymer informed me that while the IRS had already finished reviewing all 454 petitions, referring 250 of them to the Department of Justice, the Department of Justice had only made decisions on 73 of them. Furthermore, the Department of Justice only approved the return funds of 32% of the cases, well below the 80% that the IRS had recommended. One of the cases in limbo is that of Andrew Clyde that I previously mentioned. This is not good enough. I'll be following up with the department to request a fuller explanation about the remaining 181 taxpayers who've yet to receive a response as to where their money is. If there's justifiable reason for the United States government to keep their money, then so be it. Let's hear it, and let's hear it in public. But this practice of dragging these cases out for years is outrageous. Mr. Lewis, I hope that you will accept an invitation to me and join in a letter to that end. Americans deserve a government that they can trust, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with my colleagues to pass this legislation, and I encourage a favorable reporting. I yield back.